Dear viewers, welcome back to Governance this week, and I'm very happy that we have Professor Ruth Rubio Marín with us of the EUI School of Transnational Governance and an expert in gender equality, and we're going to look at International Women's Day today. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Indeed, Ruth, it is today International Women's Day. And we'd like to look at some things that we would need to do in order to make the 8th of March as International Women's Day redundant. Where should we start, do you think?
Well, it's a daunting question. Where to start? Well, let me briefly mention three things that I think would need to be achieved before we could declare Women's Day redundant. And maybe start with Men's Day. The last was a joke. So the three things I would want to start is, I think a pending subject is to overcome this division between productive and reproductive work on which, basically our capitalist system rests. This idea that there's one type of work that we value, that we attach also economic value to, which is what we call productive work, and the idea that what we call reproductive work, which is basically the work to sustain the survival of the species and reproduce it socially, is extracted from women mostly. Attached and given little value, underpaid, if at all, when performed in the labor market. I think if we could overcome that, that would be really a great way to start. And it would bring with it certain agendas. We would need to start redefining masculinity and moving further and further away from the traditional breadwinner masculinity notion. We would need to tackle the poverty of mothers and older women, which is very much linked to the fact that they have typically performed a disproportionate amount of this reproductive labor. And we would, of course, also need to reassert women's reproductive autonomy so that we don't take for granted that women's role is to reproduce and to take care of others. So that is one very, very big one.
Yeah, an important one.
Second,
indeed.
I would say parity. I mean, I would want to wake up 8th of March and just see that every side of governance, this is governance week, every side of governance, authority, power is evenly distributed between the sexes, so that we stop seeing, power and authority as a synonym of men, and we get used to the idea that women occupy not only the public sphere, but also the private sphere. I'm talking about governance in corporate boards, for instance. So parity across the board. And maybe if you allow me, I would add a third one. I would want to see wake up one day with a realization that those women who have a girl, don't feel the way I realized I didn't feel when I was told that I was having boys and not girls. And one of the first things I thought when I was told, what you carry as a boy is okay, he will have a lesser chance, less risk of being subject to violence. I think that was a sad thought, the fact that, when I was told you're having a boy, yeah. The first thing I thought is, okay, there's going to be a less of a high risk of being subject to violence. So I would say, ideally there shouldn't be any interpersonal violence. But if that is too far a goal to reach, at least I would want that risk to be evenly distributed and not so disproportionately one that falls on women.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a dad of a boy and a girl, I fully agree with you there. And what you're saying, there is definitely a lot still that needs to happen at home in the public sphere, and also in how we treat each other. So I really like those points you've shared with us there. Actually, Ruth, you're an expert in gender equality, and there are quite some misunderstandings about this topic. I think it's good to also, on a day like this, to talk about those. What are the most common misunderstandings about gender equality?
I think that's a really, really important question, which gets very rarely asked, and it is very frustrating for those of us who work on these topics, because we find ourselves again and again trying to explain some very basic facts. Maybe starting with the point that I raised around parity. I think there still is the common misunderstanding that if you go for parity and that you endorse the need to take some proactive measures, say, quotas, to get us to parity faster and not in the 200 and something years that apparently we still would need to wait if we let things unfold naturally, that we would be sacrificing meritocracy. This idea that, affirmative and positive measures to help women overcome the obstacles that they encounter would in some way sacrifice meritocracy is, I think, a very common understanding that rests on the false assumption that the distribution of power that we currently have is not attached to some, sense of privilege that men still enjoy as of today, but simply a pure reflection of their, of their natural virtues and their skills and merits. I think that's a very common misunderstanding. And, the fact that I just mentioned 3 big gaps that are still pending just tell us, that we don't have a level playing field, that we still need to overcome these disadvantages, and that the only way to do so is by proactively pushing forward people who have been held back, not because of a lack of merit, but because in spite of merit, they haven't been able to achieve the outcome that one would expect. We don't have a shortcoming of qualified, prepared, knowledgeable women. That is not the state of the art. Let me think. Well, yeah, another very common misunderstanding is, that this is some sense of like revenge feminism going on. There's this idea that, the feminist utopia now is some form of matriarchy that would, defeat patriarchy by replacing it. It's almost like, okay, you've been running the show for so many years now, let us run the show and you become the, the one who is subordinate. That is not the feminist utopia. I mean, the feminist utopia is one of human, emancipation and equality in the way, we interact with each other. It's not about reproducing patterns of domination, but simply taking shifts or turns. Yeah. So I think that's a very common misunderstanding, probably linked to the fact that when measures are taken to promote women, and the belief is that defeats meritocracy, that creates a certain form of resentment. So these two things are probably interlinked. And then I would mention one that is that has been very much displayed in my own country, in Spain, these days and these weeks. And you may have followed a big turmoil taking place in my country around legal reform on criminal sentences for sexual violence. And I think there is the common understanding that higher sentences, more punishment, more criminal law is the only or the main way to combat violence against women, which I think is a wrong perception. Of course, I'm not arguing that there should be impunity, and I am perfectly aware that for many years there was impunity. There was, in fact, impunity that was even covered by the law. If your husband mistreated you, if your partner mistreated you, that was, that's family stuff. We don't interfere into that. There is, unfortunately, a very long tradition of that. And in some countries of the world, marital rape is still not considered a rape. So don't get me wrong. I am not saying that there should be impunity, but I also think that escalating and seeing more and more higher and higher sentences is the way to go. I think that education is a really, really key element. I think that children at school should be really taught more in terms of a culture of peace and how to negotiate things and how to solve conflicts in a way that is not violent. Using words, reinforcing social skills, maybe overcoming for many the legacy of patterns and models of violent resolution of conflicts that they experience near to them. So I would say less criminal punishment and more education and more services. That would be, I think, a third element in probably not, the third one is not quite in the same category, because I understand there's more debate, though the prior two I would consider full mistakes, but I would want us feminists to give more thought about whether really just more punishment and higher sentences is the way to combat violence against women.
No, I agree, Ruth, and good also that you mentioned the word education, in the sense that hopefully, of course, future generations will do better than ours. Actually, I would like also to mention something else. The term gender equality stirs up quite some debate. Even some viewers on our YouTube channel have said in the past, there's just too much attention for this topic. What do you make of the backlash against gender equality?
No, that's a very, very important question, I think. Obviously there isn't too much talk about gender equality, or maybe there is too much talk and too little action, but I don't think that's what you meant. And that's what the people who criticize this mean. It's very interesting. I think for the first time in history, we are watching we used to have, the complaints about what we need to achieve. And it was a question of the lack of political salience and political will attached to the struggle. Right now, we are indeed living a different scenario in which certain forces are coalescing around the idea that there is a certain thing called gender ideology, and that, in fact, we've gone too far, and that we really, the gender ideology needs to be fought against. And, in that vague sentence of gender ideology, you will find things as diverse as sex education or citizenship education. Sometimes you will find, of course, same-sex marriage, the trans agenda, reproductive rights, women's reproductive rights. All of that is lumped together into this, banner. And presented as an enemy, as an enemy against what? Well, as an enemy against the traditional family, right? Which is seen, as something that is challenged, that is being undermined, and that is creating social dislocation and social anxieties. Behind this, you find a combination of actors. You will find an alliance often between nationalist or extreme right, populism, and different forms of religious fundamentalism. Strange bedfellows at times that you wouldn't think would necessarily coalesce seem to be coalescing around this. There are interesting synergies with other agendas. So often the anti-gender equality movement is linked to anti-immigrant or nativist impulses. So the idea is we and also to demographic anxieties, so we need to have we have a problem. People are not having children, and we don't want immigrant. We want our children, so we want our women to be having more children, and that can only happen if we will revert to the traditional family instead of this culture of death. The narrative is that there's a culture of life, and that feminism is bringing about a culture of death. It's abortion, it's euthanasia, it's a culture of death. So it's really worrisome, because it's it used to be something that was produced by the intelligentsia of the Vatican and other churches and little circles, but now it has really spread widely. Over the last 15 years, we've watched, for instance, 8 constitutions in Central and Eastern Europe being reformed to make sure that marriage remains a heterosexual institution. So it's not just, talk. Now there's action, and there's a whole range of constitutional tactics serving this ideal of, rescuing the traditional family. I think, the question is, that is the phenomenon. And the question, I think, behind your question is, well, what accounts for that, or how come, or what do we make of that? How do we interpret that? And I have to say that, to some extent, I'm not particularly surprised, right? This breadwinner model was, in a way, the model on which our modern democracies were grounded. It was not something pre-modern. It was actually the understanding of our modern democracies. And so it constituted a certain pillar, a certain, structure of society. And, the question is, should we be surprised if we see that there's resistance against overcoming, the patriarchal system that was built around this conception? Probably not. Ultimately, it is a question of power, and nobody and no group likes to lose power and privilege, and give in that amount of power and privilege. I also think that we need to identify or connect this anxiety that feeds into and fuels this agenda. We need to connect that with certain sense of malaise in general, that make man often resentful. We have a growing sense of dislocation linked to globalization, the survival of nativist and nationalist impulse linked to that, growing inequality, the undermining of the middle class. So, losing a privilege when you have a certain sense of self, and everything else kind of affirms your identity and your purpose, is one thing. Losing that bastion of privilege, of male privilege, when you can't make ends meet, when you feel that immigrants are stealing away, your jobs from you, that is a different scenario. So I think what's allowing for this is a combination of this other general malaise that we have, a loss of security linked to this notion of privilege, and in a way, the fact that feminists and feminism is making some gains, and so there is that sense of threat and challenge linked to the gaining of power of women, collectively speaking.
So there are
the
a lot of
synergies
different
between these various elements.
there are a lot of different factors at play, as you're pointing out.
Indeed.
And in fact, you kind of introduced already my concluding question to you, which is about the people who are actually trying to make sure that International Women's Day will become redundant. The feminist movement, or should I say the feminist movements. What are we talking about here?
Indeed. Feminism is deeply split as we speak, and precisely the people who challenge the gains made by feminism are really happy, to see feminists being split in this way. I mean, it's no secret to anyone that, the trans agenda is one around which feminists are angrily divided to this day. What would I say to that? Well, the one thing I have to say is that it is natural that feminists are divided. I mean, there isn't a single vision of the feminist utopia. There isn't a single idea around what the emancipation of human beings requires. And even if we could agree on all the goals, we would still naturally have disagreements around strategies, right? How do you get from here to there? Is this step a conducive step? Is it going to backfire? I mean, why should feminists, agree on everything? Why shouldn't it be natural that feminism be divided around a whole set of questions? Feminists have not agreed on other issues. They haven't agreed on pornography, surrogacy. Black feminists have historically and continue to this day challenge the privilege of middle class, in mainstream feminists. Queer feminism has also challenged liberal feminism in many ways. So I think that, not agreeing on all the principles, all the strategies, or how to negotiate the intersecting and interacting factors of inequality and subordination and oppression is natural. What I deeply regret is the degree of violence and anger that division is provoking, quite honestly. And in that sense, I would very much like to reclaim feminists' old commitment to pacifism and to peaceful negotiation of conflicts. I think that we should really not let our differences become things that disunite us so deeply that we allow for many of the gains to be challenged by those who indeed see us as very unified and as representing and embodying the enemy. So first, let's not make a big fuss. Feminists, of course, have to disagree on things, right? Only a certain essentialized notion of what it is to be a woman and what feminism is about would imagine a world where we agree on everything. But secondly, let's not fall in the trap of performing those disagreements in radically violent and really it's
No,
angry and violent, and we're disqualified as a whole when we do that. And people are rubbing their hands. Some people are rubbing their hands and say, well, see, they can't even agree themselves. And, but again, they do see us as united because they do identify this common enemy, even though there's actually internal disagreement, as I said, there should be.
I hear you there. And of course, also it's a sign, of course, of the success of the feminist cause that there is, that there are increasingly diverse voices, being added to the choir, and that the cause is growing. I must say, Ruth, you've shared a lot of important notions with us here today. The 8th of March, International Women's Day 2023, and here's hoping that one day it's no longer needed to celebrate it, at least in this way, as a challenge. To achieve gender equality, and that we will make the progress you have been talking to us about. So thanks a lot for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, Ruth.
Thank you, and I will toast to that.
Cheers. Bye, Ruth. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.